It's going live. Probably got like three, two, one, and we're live. What's up, everybody out there? Good to be back. It's been a while since I've done a live stream. I think it's maybe been 3 or 4 months since I've been on a live stream. I have my streaming abilities back, and here we go. I'm live with the legendary Stan Efferding. Got the strongest bodybuilder in the world, IFBB Pro, Stan Efferding. How's it going, man?
Good, man. Is legendary a kind way to say old? Is that how that works?
Dude, oh man, loading it up there. Well, how old are you, Stan? I mean, how many years you been around this planet?
Almost 52 now, so I've been around a
Wow.
little while.
Well, you don't look a day over 51.
Well, that's awesome, man. And
No.
I'm doing the right thing. And I might be able to sell some diets to some people who don't want to look older than 51.
No, but you've been somebody that I've paid close attention to for years now. Somebody I've got a lot of respect for. Um, your accomplishments are pretty awesome. I mean, I don't want to just sit here and toot your horn. I'm sure a lot of people have done that for me in the past. But let's just kind of go over some of your athletic accomplishments so that the audience has sort of an idea of where you're coming from. Now, right now, you're an IFBB pro, right?
Yeah, I started as a little guy back in college, 140 pounds, and I wanted to get bigger and stronger. And so I just made that a kind of a lifetime pursuit and hobby of mine. And I ultimately became an IFBB professional bodybuilder, and I set a few all-time world records in powerlifting over the course of the time I was competing.
Were you all right? So before you got really into powerlifting, you were a bodybuilder, or was it vice versa? Which one did you get into first?
Well, I was a bodybuilder first. I was so weak. When I was in college, I was 140 pounds. I couldn't even bench 135. I had to take the 45s off and put the 35s on just to do a rep. And so, I thought I had to get stronger in order to get bigger. It was kind of the initial pursuit. And so I just lifted as heavy as I could. I learned many years later, of course, that wasn't the case, that hypertrophy training is very different than strength training. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it took me probably a good 6 or 7 years before I had any significant strength. It took a long time to build that up. And in my first powerlifting meet, I think it was 2000, I started competing in 1986 in bodybuilding, and it was 1995 that I did my first powerlifting meet. I totaled 2,000 pounds in the 275-pound class.
And how many other people in the world have actually accomplished those types of numbers?
Well, there's a few now. I ultimately ended up with the world record of 2,303 pounds. There's one guy in Russia that beat that in the 275 class. And then I had the world record, 2,226 pounds with knee sleeves, no knee wraps. And Larry Wheels came along and beat that one. So both of those records have been eclipsed, but I'm still the only man over 40 ever to total 2,300 pounds. That's never been done by anybody else.
Wow. So you're still holding that legitimate world record. That's pretty cool. I mean, a lot of people are trying to build muscle. You mentioned the difference between hypertrophy training and strength training. And a lot of people believe that one of the best ways to build muscle is to get strong, right? I think a lot of people when they're starting out, they get on like a 5x5 type routine, a basic strength training routine. I'd love to kind of maybe share your views on what the best route to take is to put on some muscle for people who might be underweight. We've got a lot of former vegans who watch the channel here, a lot of recovering vegans. We've got a lot of future ex-vegans watching the channel now. For people who are trying to gain some muscle and to put on some pounds, what do you think the best way to go about it is as far as training goes?
Well, obviously you're going to need to be, or it's optimal to be, in a calorie surplus. That's probably one of the biggest things that you want to focus on. And it's just easier to gain muscle in a calorie surplus. Once you've accomplished that, and of course, getting adequate protein, and I usually look at that as being about a gram of protein per pound of body weight, is kind of all the protein you'd ever need. You could probably go as low as zero point 0.8 or 0.7 grams per pound, to be honest with you, as long as you're getting adequate carbohydrates to be protein sparing. And now this, kind of gets us into the rest of the macros in terms of athletic performance and, training to optimize hypertrophy. I do believe that carbohydrates are a significant contributor to that. They create kind of an anabolic environment. They take on 4 parts water for every 1 part carbs, and they take on sodium, of course, with that water. And that creates an anabolic environment. It's ideal for anaerobic training. That glucose is optimal for, for the muscles to perform their work. It just makes you able to lift more weights for more reps more often and recover faster. So, of course, that always gets us into the debate of whether or not, keto versus low carb versus high carb. But this is a very specific instance for competitive athletes and those that are trying to optimize hypertrophy. I really think it's beneficial. Obviously, you want to be at a calorie surplus. You want to get adequate protein. And I'm a big proponent of getting adequate carbohydrates to fuel those workouts in particular. You kind of got to earn the carbs in my mind. That's not to say it's for everybody, but the specific question is with respect to optimizing hypertrophy. Yeah. And then you're down to the training stimulus. Well, I should say that sleep is probably the most important thing in terms of recovery from training. So let's throw that in there. Now, the training stimulus is, I think optimally, if you're looking at science-based research, the stuff from Brett Contreras and Brad Schoenfeld and the rest of the researchers that you look at the stuff coming out of Mass Research Review with who are those folks down there at, why is his name escaping me right now? Greg Nuckols. Yeah. There's some great stuff coming out that really looks at the science and really, first of all and foremost, frequency. You want to train every body part twice a week. And that if you do, your upper body, or if you do your whole body Monday and whole body Friday, that's fine. The once a week bro splits aren't as effective. You generally can recover within 48 to 72, 96 hours max before you want to get another workout in, just in terms of continuing to provide the right stimulus. And then, after that, we're looking at volume, and it seems that about 10 to 20 sets a week per body part seems to be kind of the ideal range. And that kind of gets us to your original question next, which is load. And you can build just as much muscle lifting heavy for 5 reps as you can lifting lighter for 20 reps. You can do an 85% of your 1 rep max for 5 reps and get maximum muscle fiber recruitment and stimulate hypertrophy and get the same hypertrophy benefit as if you do 50% loads for 20 reps. The difference between the two, obviously, is you're going to get stronger with the 5 rep loads than you are with the 20 rep loads. And the similarity between the two in terms of stimulating hypertrophy is you're going to have to get within a rep or 2 of failure. In order to get maximum muscle fiber recruitment, you can't do 10 reps with a load that you could have done for 20 and expect to get maximal muscle fiber recruitment. Your muscles will not recruit all of the fibers necessary to create the right stimulus until you get within a couple reps of failure. Now, having said that, it seems that you can create more fatigue at the 5 rep range and the 20 rep range. And so this gets us back to the bros were right, that it seems the 8 to 12 rep range is kind of the optimal rep range, because you're going to create a little less fatigue than the heavy stuff, the 5 rep stuff. And remember, frequency matters. Frequency and volume are more important than muscle damage. Yeah. And in terms of long-term compliance, we find that in the studies that the people who do the really heavy loads tend to build up a lot of fatigue. They fall off at a greater rate. They get injured at a greater rate. And I think that kind of the next thing in there is really periodization. You can include some 5 rep sets. You can include some 20 rep sets. But generally speaking, the bulk of your volume should be in the 8 to 12 rep range, and you should be focused on getting ample recovery before you train again. So, I mean, that kind of covers, I think, the big pieces for hypertrophy for the general population.
What about the types of movements? I mean, do you recommend compound movements? You have some people who say avoid deadlifting, avoid bench pressing. I've seen some pretty goofy videos of some people doing some chest flies with like 10-pound weights and with really bad form, talking about how they're going to put on more muscle than if they were doing a bench press. I mean, what types of movement selection do you usually use with people trying to put on some muscle?
Well, in terms of recruiting the most musculature to benefit just in terms of return on investment, if you're going to go in and do an exercise, you'd like to recruit a lot of muscle. A bench press is going to work your chest, shoulders, and tris. And so you're just going to work more muscle, build more muscle. I think a combination of both. I like to start with a multi-joint movement, such as bench press. I prefer incline dumbbell or a slight incline dumbbell because I can get a greater range of motion. I can get independent movement of my shoulders. So I don't, for me at my age, I'm cautious about restricting my my joints to, anytime you grab a hold of the bar, what one arm does, the other one kind of has to do. It's in a fixed position. And range of motion is huge. I didn't mention that in the hypertrophy guidelines, but the greater range of motion is going to provide a better hypertrophy response. It's true with, how deep you take your leg presses and your squats, and it's different than strength. Both can be beneficial for strength, but the greater range of motion seems to aid hypertrophy better. So I'm picking multi-joint mass building movements, and then if I have a difficult time isolating a muscle and getting a good pump, then I'm throwing in an isolation. I think both, I guess, is the answer to that. You definitely want to recruit as much muscle as possible. But in some cases, like with me, I was such a powerlifting oriented lifter that I would use a lot of, I would incorporate too much glute in the squat. So I wasn't getting much quad work. And so I did have to get onto the leg press and bring my feet in and down to get a full stretch. I had to do some more unilateral movements, some walking lunges or some, Bulgarian split squats to really isolate the legs. Because when I squatted, I would throw everything on the hips and glutes. And to me, it was just about how much weight I could lift. Same thing with chest. The bench didn't seem to work my chest very much because I was a big shoulder presser. That's why I went to dumbbells, and I kept my sternum high and did a full range of motion. So I think all of those things matter. I hate to talk about things in terms of either or. It's kind of a good, better, best scenario. Yeah. And I think that you need plenty of variety. Like we said, with the rep range itself, do some 5s, do some 10s, do some 20s, probably more 10s than 5s or 20s if it's hypertrophy focus. And then, just get some isolation exercises in as well as multi-joint movements. And, I think the big thing is over time, your body's going to adapt to whatever stimulus you're providing. And so there has to be some variation over time, either in sets, reps, weight, rest periods. We're not talking about a P90X program. You certainly want to stick with it long enough to get some sort of adaptation. The muscle confusion principle has long been debunked. You're not going to get, an adequate hypertrophy response unless you keep after that for a while. But every 6 or 8 weeks or so, you should consider changing your training a little bit, using a variation of the exercise, changing your rest periods, changing your rep ranges, and that kind of thing. So there should be some variation over time. No one program's going to consistently work for the long term.
Right. That's cool. Yeah, it seems like you got to take context into consideration as well. So variety of different movements, variety of different rep ranges from different angles. It seems like you're trying to basically hit it from every angle and maximize the response there.
Yeah, what a huge thing is there has to be some sort of progression. If you continue to do the same thing you've always done, your body's not going to respond. It needs a new stimulus. And so you got to take your body somewhere it hasn't been before. And that doesn't always necessarily mean just keep increasing the weight. Again, you can change your rep ranges. You can change your rest periods. You can make slight variations in the fundamental movements. But generally speaking, you're going to have to keep challenging yourself or your body to adapt. And that's the hardest part about the difference between a beginner and advanced lifter. Advanced lifters have to be really creative and very determined to continue to get any additional growth.
Nice. All right. So we talked a little bit about carbohydrates a minute ago. I think that's a really important subject to hit on here. You got a lot of people in the low carbohydrate community that swear you can build muscle just as easily with no carbohydrates. A lot of people are thinking the carbohydrates are absolutely unnecessary. As somebody who's done a ketogenic and carnivorous diet for the last 6 years, what I found is that carbohydrates are definitely a performance booster. They're definitely very, very useful for gaining muscle. So I most emphatically agree with you there. What type of carbohydrates do do you implement with athletes and with people trying to put some muscle on? What type of carbs do you go for?
Well, I always like to focus on the foundation first. When I put people on my diet program with the vertical diet, I try and build a solid foundation. So my carbs start with those that provide the micronutrients that you need to be healthy and to perform. Potassium being a big one. And so I always throw a daily potato in. I need to get 4,700 milligrams of potassium in my athletes. And so I usually have that in there, and then some fruit as well. And then if they have a greater workload demand, either they have a large amount of muscle mass and need significant number of calories, or if they've got a high workload like a CrossFitter or a UFC fighter training twice a day, and I need to feed them, hundreds of grams of carbs to fuel that workload, then I'm throwing white rice at them strictly as a very easy to digest, very efficient carbohydrate source just to fuel the workload. It's not terribly nutrient dense, but if I throw more potatoes or, pizza, pasta, pancakes, or grains or bread at people, and oatmeal even, they're going to start bloating and getting gassy and have a hard time digesting any significant quantity of those. Not that they're necessarily bad for you per se, but as a high performing athlete, any significant amount of those is going to start to wreak digestion havoc.
What about for people who have issues with fiber? Some people are real sensitive to foods like potato. A lot of people that end up finding themselves on a carnivorous diet or either coming from a diet that wrecked their gut, or have autoimmune conditions pre-existing already and have issues with digest and stuff like potatoes. Do you ever get cases like that where you got to kind of mess around with the carbohydrate sources to accommodate gut sensitivities?
I certainly do. And that was always a huge thing for me. Digestion throughout my career was always complicated. I ultimately found out my trigger was vegetable oils, however. And I can't tolerate lots of bread. I cannot tolerate oatmeal. So I have a similar issue with lots of fiber. Cruciferous vegetables, also. So I shoot for low FODMAP foods to begin with. The science seems to support that those are more easily tolerated. And I also, with potatoes, if you cook them soft and use a regular potato, it seems sweet potato is less tolerable than the regular potato. And if they still can't tolerate that, fruit is very well tolerated. That's generally low FODMAP. Fruits like oranges and berries and melons and the like. And even then, fruit juice. I've had really good luck with athletes in terms of maintaining their appetite by putting just a little bit of orange juice in each meal. And I'm not talking about driving calories with it. I'm talking about using it to provide them the micronutrients that I want to get them, the extra potassium. Some people who can tolerate dairy, I think it's very beneficial. The calcium is great for more than just bones. It's great for nerve signaling, for muscle firing, muscle contraction. Calcium's hugely important for that. And so I do include some of that, and you'll get some lactose from that. And it just depends on whether or not you tolerate it very well, but not a ton of it. We don't drive calories with it. So again, I'm sensitive with fiber. I'm concerned about things like lectins and phytates and anti-nutrients and cruciferous vegetables that impede mineral absorption, and they bind to minerals and they impede uptake of iodine. So I'm cautious with those. Again, I'm not saying that those foods are bad for you necessarily, but people have different tolerance levels. It's individualistic. It's dose dependent. How they prepare it matters. I tend to be really careful about people's digestion first, and I'm not driving fiber as a priority over things like, highly digestible micronutrient dense foods like ruminant animals, beef, eggs. I think you can get all your micronutrients from those. And then, if I use a fiber, it's going to be a low FODMAP source. Carrots seem to be pretty well tolerated, just if you needed to get a little bit of the root tubers. Potatoes with the resistant starch, it kind of depends on the individual, whether they get gassy or not, and how much they eat, and how well they're cooked, and whether they're fresh. If you cool a potato and heat it up the next day, it's going to be harder to digest. So when I get feedback from clients, I usually kind of go down that hierarchy and find out whether or not there's a way in which we could get those micronutrients in them. If not, we'll just switch gears. We'll throw a ton of salmon at them. There's over 150 milligrams of potassium for every ounce of salmon that you eat. We have alternatives, and fiber is not a priority for me if it impedes digestion and absorption of nutrients and performance, gas and bloating. So I'm kind of on the fence on that one. I try and throw some in there, but
Yeah.
I don't lead with it.
Yeah, I've noticed there's kind of a trend of the some of these trainers you see like within the UFC and stuff with fighters. I see a lot of these guys recommending whole grains, and I see a lot of recommendations of things like quinoa, stuff like that. And I don't know, it kind of makes me concerned. You know, I mean, I'm somebody who's dealt with sensitive digestion as well, and anytime I've tried to put on weight using the wrong types of food, it's made it pretty difficult, right? So when I see like UFC fighters guzzling down the quinoa and these things that are just full of things like saponins and tannins and indigestible grains, it kind of makes me worried. What do you think? What's your perspective on the current state of sports nutrition? Do you think a lot of people are getting it right, or do you think that there's that we've got a long way to go as far as most of the mainstream advice towards athletes? Because I mean, whenever I see every once in a while one of these athletes, they'll throw up like a full day of eating video. Like Stephen Thompson put one up a few months ago. And I mean, it's even peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and one little piece of fruit and like a couple eggs, and it's man, the protein was so low, and he's thinking peanut butter's a superfood. So, yeah, what do you think about the way that most of these athletes are eating right now?
I think it's terrible. I think it's been terrible for the 30 years that I've been competing. I've watched it on both ends of the spectrum. It's one of the advantages I have. I have a science degree from the University of Oregon. I've been studying this all my life, and I've been a competitor. I've dieted down to 4% body fat and competed in professional bodybuilding. And I've bulked up to over 300 pounds on multiple occasions to set world record in powerlifting. So I know food. I know how to utilize it for performance. And I've done many, many things wrong over the years. And I've watched hundreds, if not thousands of athletes now go through diets that I've helped them with. And I've learned that on the food restriction end, on the competitive figure, physique, bikini bodybuilding people, they do a lot of things wrong. They over restrict. They eliminate. They use egg whites and white fish and broccoli. They eliminate red meat. They eliminate fruit. They eliminate dairy. They eliminate salt. They eliminate all foods that are just so critical, and then they end up with hypothyroidism and hair falling out from biotin deficiencies and anemia and a whole host of things, and they end up at the doctor getting shots for B12 and iron and vitamin D. So I've seen it's very disgraceful that what's happened in the professional dieting industry, bodybuilding, figure physique, bikini, has permeated other dieting sports like UFC fighters. And for instance, they have to maintain weight, and so they want to diet, and so they look to bodybuilders for advice. And it's terrible advice when you start restricting all of those very important performance foods and end up with nutrient deficiencies. And initially they might feel a little better. They're losing some weight. They're stopped eating fast foods and other garbage. The problem is that the performance, the deficiencies manifest over time, depending on how much reserves they have of these micronutrients, and whether it's a month or 3 months, or sometimes maybe a little bit longer, eventually they start to break down. You see it happening with all of these athletes, like recently that were in the Game Changers movie, and so many of them are injured now, and so many of them, have just had underperformed. Obviously, Cam Newton's one who's just underperformed. He's lost weight and strength, and DeMarcus Cousins got injured, and Nate Diaz isn't even a vegan. He eats fish, but
he eats a lot of shellfish. There's a video of Nate Diaz and Nick Diaz with Anthony Bourdain, and they're having a feast of shrimp. So anybody who's saying that Nate Diaz is a vegan out there, I don't think you guys understand what veganism actually is. He's eating plenty of shellfish and fish.
Yeah, but I don't mean to segue too far out of the question, but for these athletes that are using these foods, the co-author of The Vertical Diet is a registered dietitian with a PhD in exercise science. He's head of the dietetic program at UNLV. So I'm very appreciative of the knowledge base that these folks have. But without any practical application, and I work with a top NFL lineman right now, a Super Bowl champion NFL lineman, who was given a diet just like that with 3 cups of quinoa a day and no red meat. He's 325 pounds, and his digestion was wreaking havoc on him, and he was losing weight. He couldn't eat enough food. So there are some considerations to be had on the dieting end. The gastric distress and the digestion problems are huge. On the bulking side, being able to eat and assimilate those kinds of foods is damn near impossible in the quantities that they have to consume them. My job is to make sure that it's easier for them to eat as many calories as they need each day, because that, calories are king in terms of performance for those large athletes. So I guess generally speaking, I think we've done a terrible job. There are some great resources out there, whether or not they're loud enough and popular enough yet to, to help to trickle down into the mainstream. I don't think it's happened quite yet. I still see lots and lots of athletes, trying to do what they think is healthy, what's been purported to be healthy. And I'm all about micronutrients, but with the anti-nutrients in some of those foods and the lack of digestibility and the huge prevalence of things like IBS and IBD, which I think is largely been compounded by the consumption of vegetable oils. A lot of these digestion problems are kind of predicated by the fact that we've been eating all these seed oils in such great quantities for so many years, and I think we've deteriorated our digestion.
Yeah, I agree. It's crazy to see someone. I did a video about Cam Newton's situation not too long ago, and it's just nuts to see somebody's career kind of deteriorate like that, as they as they think they're doing something better for themselves. They think it's better for the planet. They think it's better for their health. Yet all of these are kind of built on a sandy foundation. All of these assumptions, and I mean, it's a real shame to see somebody who's making millions of dollars, who's one of the top athletes in the world, wreck it with diet. And it's not just diet, obviously, but it does play a major part. I mean, anybody who's done any athletics and tinkered with diet at all understands this. And this is why I love talking to guys like you. I mean, you mentioned earlier, you're 52 years old. You're still cranking it out, right? You're still out there performing better than I ever have at any point in my life. You're still out there, lifting more weight, maintaining this incredible physique, and I think it's really important to look at the people who've had longevity in their career and who've been able to do this without falling off the map, without deflating themselves through diet. So, yeah.
Ed, I did a video, a Rhino's Rant, on YouTube where I talked about if you want to be healthy, don't compete. And I talked about the difference between health and fitness, and they're not the same. A UFC fighter, an NFL lineman, a strongman, for them to have the fitness to be able to perform the task is not healthy. There's no question about it. That's not a long-term plan. But you need to use nutrition and sleep and all of these things, these tools, to mitigate the damage that you're doing. And if you're compounding the problem by adding in foods that are hard to digest, I think that, or eliminating foods that provide you the micronutrients that you need to repair, which often happens with the dieting industry. And the bulking guys tend to end up overeating the wrong foods and end up with fatty liver disease and metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and high cholesterol and high blood pressure. Those kinds of things happen with the wrong diet as well. So, I'm not a prude with respect to what's necessary for people to compete. Obviously, I've done it at both ends, both extremes. But at the same time, I think that there's, like you said about guys like Cam, who thinks he's making a decision to be healthier. And he's in fact gotten less healthy. He's lost muscle, lost strength. His performance has suffered. And he's just one example of many. I see it all the time with these athletes. Unfortunately, the prevailing wisdom out there has, we've just been inundated with quote unquote research, this horrible epidemiology, this diarrhea of epidemiology, which is just terrible research. And it's supported by lots of characters that are highly biased by the canola industry and corn oil and Kellogg's and Kraft Foods and the rest of them, and they're trying to tell us that these foods are healthy, and and in fact they're not. And so we're making these decisions based on bad research.
Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of bad research, what do you think about this whole push for plant-based diets for athletes and stuff? I mean, we're seeing, you mentioned the game changers earlier. And the internet, YouTube, you get a lot of these vegan channels making videos talking about how veganism is such a it's such a great way to go for athletes. I mean, me personally, I've messed around with a vegan vegetarian diet, and it really wrecked me. So I'm pretty. I'm a little bit sensitive about the subject, and I definitely have my own opinion of it. What do you think about meatless diets for performance, and even full-on vegan diets for performance, as per recommended by guys like Arnold Schwarzenegger now, and even James Cameron, who produced a 2-hour pea protein isolate documentary called the Game Changers. What do you think about this approach to nutrition for athletes?
I think it's terrible. I think it's propaganda. It's more vegan propaganda put forth by people like James Cameron, who has a large financial interest in the pea protein manufacturing. Of course, PETA is another organization who uses their vegan army to try and shame people or legislate their morality on people. It's again full of really bad, financially promoted, research from canola industry and the like. We know that Procter and Gamble paid off the American Heart Association in the '60s with millions of dollars to promote Ansel Keys, cholesterol lipid heart hypothesis, which has completely been debunked as false research, and that was pervasive. American Heart Association gave us trans fats, which for 40 years were accepted up until most recently as being heart healthy. Come to find out that they're not, and they've caused an extraordinary amount of damage. In addition to consuming more calories since the 1950s, the only other thing that we've increased to a significant degree is seed oils. And those seed oils have been pushed on us by these organizations to replace things like beef and eggs and dairy because of their moral position, not because of health. And the vast majority of research that they use is this horrible, horrible epidemiology, as I mentioned. Yeah. Dr. Ioannidis is probably the one of the leading. He's a professor of medicine and professor of statistics and a professor of health research at Stanford University, and he's known as the godfather of meta research. And he, in no uncertain terms, has come out and said this epidemiology is garbage, and we need to move away from it. 95% of the nutritional research is biased, and we can't get any factual information from this. And I think we've seen now with the recent AIM report, the Annals of Internal Medicine, that the publications that came out was the meta-analysis of all of the studies, the epidemiological studies, with respect to plant-based versus meat-based, and they concluded that there just wasn't enough information to suggest that we should be eating plants instead of beef. They did 3 meta-analyses of all of the observational studies, the epidemiology, and when you look at absolute versus relative risks, what they found was, even with as poor of research as this is, which again is highly biased, that you might be able to attribute 4 fewer deaths for every 1,000 people over 11 years. And that's in the most negative case from the epidemiology, which is horrible research. They also did a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials and found that there's no relationship between the consumption of red and processed meat and adverse health outcomes. And that the conclusions were based, again, on low quality evidence. Even the randomized controlled trials are low quality evidence, and they just couldn't find any relationship. So I think that it's very weakly based. It's highly biased, of course, with, people talk about IARC and their cancer research. IARC is largely a group of publishing vegans who claim no bias, by the way, who looked at only a small percentage of only epidemiology. They didn't look at any randomized controlled trials. And as Dr. Ioannidis said, that of 52 randomized controlled trials that were conducted to perform to determine whether or not the epidemiology was correct, they found no correlation, no correlation or causation effect using randomized controlled trials. So The research out there is horrible. It's just being used, as a campaign slogan to help people with their own bias and interest to influence other people. And I think that's terrible. I hope that kind of
Yeah.
covers the way I feel about,
Yeah.
I think if somebody wants to eat vegan, they can eat vegan. If you're asking me as a coach, based on the research and experience in terms of whether or not athletes are going to perform better, I don't think there's any evidence that athletes are going to perform better on a vegan diet, and probably much worse.
Yeah, I think that's a real nice way of saying it, especially with what we've seen with guys like Cam Newton. I mean, I got a lot of former vegans as clients who come to me and trying to get their health back, trying to get their digestion back, and there are a lot of these patterns that you see repeating within the vegan world of digestive issues, brain fog, mental health issues, deterioration, both mental and physical, and it's getting kind of ridiculous out there with all this vegan propaganda. What do you think about there's some claims that the strongest man in Germany is a vegan? You heard about this guy Patrick Baboumian? He's in the Game Changers pea protein advertisement documentary.
Yeah, and I have vegan and vegetarian clients who, for ethical reasons, choose to do that. Vegetarian actually is not vegan. If you're lacto-ovo or you're pescatarian, you're eating fish or you're eating eggs and dairy,
Yeah.
you're going to be just fine if you can tolerate all of the vegetables. And it's been my experience. A lot of people have a lot of digestion problems. But I think the best diet's the one you'll follow, and I think people can realize significant health benefits just from weight loss and regular exercise, and not eating the standard American diet, staying away from the French fries and the buns and the mayonnaise and the vegetable oils. So I just want to pre-qualify this. I don't have a campaign against people who choose to do vegan or vegetarian. I don't believe that it's healthier by any stretch of the imagination, and the research seems to confirm that. So with respect to him, I think that you can eat a vegetarian or a vegan diet and you can be healthy. I think a lot of people aren't. I think that with the digestion issues that you mentioned and the brain fog and, the deterioration, the dental issues and on the host of other things. But he's not a good example simply because he's not highly competitive at an international level. He's just, they talk about a world's strongest man. I think that they've inflated his records. Obviously, he doesn't compare to the athletes that I work with, the Robert Obersts of the world, the Brian Shaws, the Hafthor Bjornsons. I mean, he's just not anywhere near the top tier. And, this isn't a knock on the gentleman. He's obviously done some great things, in competition. But if we're talking about optimizing performance, and a vegan diet is not that. And he's not an example of someone who has used a vegan diet to win at a very high level. He's kind of at the next tier of athletes, which is, fantastic. I don't want to take anything away from it. It's just, you're asking me as a coach if I would recommend that diet for the world's strongest man who I train. Absolutely not.
Well, let's talk about what they eat. These world's strongest men, the actual strongest men in the world. You work with some real beasts, and what kind of athletes, as far as strongman athletes, world's strongest man competitors, are you working with, and what the heck are they putting down the gullet to maintain that weight and strength and to perform like that?
Yeah, I think people know I worked with Hafthor Bjornsson for the last 3 years. I spent 2 years working with Brian Shaw up until just recently. He signed a sponsorship deal with Trifecta. Obviously, I can't work with him anymore because I've got a competing food prep company. So
well, the vegans are going to say you got fired because you were recommending him dangerous advice or something, right? I'm sure there's going to be a narrative woven about that one.
No, Brian's his health improved significantly. We did multiple blood tests. His body composition improved. His strength improved. In 2017, he deadlifted 991 at the Arnold. Then I started work with him in 2018. He deadlifted 1,014, and in 2019 he deadlifted 1,021. So Brian got stronger. He got more fit. He got more healthy. His digestion improved. His body composition improved. All of those things, So clearly he's still incorporating a lot of the same fundamental principles, getting adequate micronutrients first. But here's how I build any athlete's diet, whether it's a 450-pound Hafthor Bjornsson, or I just trained Nadia Wyatt, who was 115 pounds, and she took third in the Miss Olympia figure.
Mm-hmm.
And I work with a 97-pound professional ballet dancer for the Sacramento Ballet Company. So I build them a foundation of highly micronutrient dense, easy to digest, highly bioavailable foods. They all have at least some eggs in their diet daily, the choline, the biotin, the K2. They all have some fruit in their diet daily. They all have adequate potassium, whether it be a potato or the like. They all have salmon twice a week to get their EPA and DHA. They all eat ruminants. They eat ruminant animals. It's just going to be beef or bison or lamb or deer. You know, ruminants convert cellulose into micronutrients that you can digest. And they're higher in iron, they're higher in B12, they're higher in zinc and selenium. They're superior to vegetables, obviously, in terms of nutrient density, but also the ruminants are superior to, say, chicken and turkey, which are monogastric. They're one stomach animals that are fed soy, and they have a higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So, and less nutrients. It's not to say that chicken and turkey couldn't be used to satisfy your protein. You know, certainly that they're plenty adequate for that. But you know, when I'm talking about working with athletes, I use a superior source, and that's ruminant animals. So I use red meat with them. They all get adequate protein. They get about 1 gram per pound of protein. They get, you know, fats from, you know, assorted fats from the beef itself, which is over 50% monounsaturated, even though I'm not afraid of saturated fats by any stretch of the imagination. I don't stuff them full of sticks of butter, but, you know, eggs also has a good fatty profile, fish as well. And then beyond that, I have to give them adequate carbohydrates to fuel their workload. And as we opened with, that's got to be something that's easy to digest, that they can, you know, be able to perform on and not be all bloated and gassy and impede their nutrient absorption.
Right. And when you talk about micronutrients, the micronutrients you're focused on, you mentioned potassium, you threw zinc in there, iron. What other micronutrients are you focused on making sure that these athletes have in the tank?
Well, obviously, potassium and sodium are huge. I have them salt their meals to taste daily. That's a recommendation, obviously, by Dr. D. Nicolantonio from the book The Salt Fix, and also Dr. Sandra Godick, who is the head of the Heat Institute. She's a PhD in thermoregulation and hydration. You know, I get the best information I can from I think the best academic resources, and try and apply it to my athletes. And sodium's huge. We salt all our meals to taste. We take sodium before and after training. It's a huge performance enhancer. The International Society of Sports Nutrition recommends that, 500 milligrams before and after training. Those are the two biggies. And then there's a host of things, like I mentioned, the iron and the B12 are huge, especially for women who, you know, with menstruation, they tend to lose iron in their diet. And then with the training and the like, they end up with anemia in many cases and amenorrhea. So that's another thing the ruminants are important for, is getting adequate iron. Vitamin B12 is huge for energy, for the mitochondria and every cell in the body. And that's going to be very prevalent in red meat as well. B12 is important. In the eggs, the choline is huge in egg yolks. You need about 1,000 milligrams of choline a day to help prevent and even cure fatty liver disease, which is a problem with these large athletes who end up with metabolic syndrome. Choline and B12 and folate, all three of them together, hugely help with that. And I've had many, many large athletes with, you know, metabolic syndrome, high cholesterol, fatty liver, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, very common amongst powerlifters and strongmen, and even, you know, offensive linemen for 300 plus pound football players. And one of the ways to treat that is to get adequate micronutrients, choline being the primary one. Biotin for skin, hair, and nails, that's also in your egg yolks. If you're eating just whites, the egg white binds to biotin. And if you don't have egg yolk with it, it'll bind to the biotin in your body and make you biotin deficient. And that's when women's hair start falling out, just because they're using all the egg whites and no egg yolk. K2 is huge for, you know, shuttling calcium away from the soft tissues and into the bones. And, you know, that's again in egg yolks. Magnesium's another big one, and that's really hard to get from the diet. That's one of the things we supplement here in my program. 400 milligrams a day of magnesium really is hugely beneficial as well. And then vitamin D3 is also very hard to get from the diet if you're not getting sun exposure, particularly if you're not near the equator. Seattle, where I was from the last 20 years, full of people with seasonal affective disorder who
Yeah.
who are vitamin D deficient. So we supplement vitamin D in most of our athletes. I run blood tests on most of my athletes to identify a deficiency first. I'm not big on mega dosing. We learned from Ansel Keys many decades ago that antioxidant megadosing such as vitamin A or vitamin E, etc., ends up with toxicities and can cause more problems than it solves. So I'm just not a big supplement guy. That's what worries me about veganism is they're really supplementarians. They end up with this, they're just taking a whole handful of supplements. And what we've seen is you're much more likely to get toxic levels of things like iron when you supplement it as opposed to when you eat it with your food. Yeah. And even calcium, when you supplement calcium, it can increase cardiovascular disease as opposed to if you eat it through a food source, it can decrease cardiovascular disease, as such the research suggests. So I'm cautious with supplementation. I try and get everything from food, but those are some of the major ones. I might not have mentioned iodine, which is also enormously important, particularly for athletes that sweat a lot. They sweat out iodine. And if with an iodine deficiency, you end up with hypothyroidism. And that's why we put, the CDC put iodine in sodium or in salt back in the 1920s, is because we had so many people with goiter and iodine deficiencies. And it leads to retardation, particularly in infants and pregnant mothers with their children. An IQ, a lower IQ as a result of iodine deficiency. But it can be huge for performance, huge for digestion, huge for immune system. And so I throw iodine into every diet as well, whether or not it's some cranberry juice. Some pure cranberry juice has just a few ounces, can give you 300% of your RDA, or an iodized salt. I know people will try and preferentially use sea salt or pink salt, but there's no iodine in it. Then, we demonize table salt as having bleaching agents or anti-caking agents. But the research that's been done on it suggests that those things don't cause health problems. Some of the research it was actually done in a book called The Bad Food Bible by Dr. Aaron Carroll, who runs the YouTube site Healthcare Triage. He's the dean of research at Indiana, and he's an MD. And just saying, there's good research to suggest that the iodine in table salt is more important than not getting iodine. If you choose to use pink salt or sea salt, that's fine. I'm kind of a salt snob. I use Redmond real salt, but I also take my cranberry juice daily. Or somebody could supplement with, say, some what am I thinking of? Seaweed.
Like dulse and kelp and stuff like that.
Yeah, kelp to get additional iodine. I'm just saying it's important. And if you don't have a source in your diet, all of these things are important. If you're not getting 4,700 milligrams of potassium, if you're not getting adequate sodium, if you're not getting adequate iodine, biotin, choline, iron, B12, magnesium, D3, those things should all be in your diet in an absorbable form. A lot of those things are in vegetables, but they aren't very well absorbed. It's like the difference between, carotenoids versus retinols, or heme iron versus non-heme iron.
Yes.
It's harder to absorb a lot of those nutrients because of the anti-nutrients that are in them. So you got to be cautious that you're getting them from a good source.
There's someone in the chat through a super chat. Thanks for the super chat, man. He's asking how much calcium in general you're recommending. This kind of lines up with the micronutrients thing. He's asking if 2,000 milligrams a day is enough.
I think the recommendation is around 1,000 to 1,200. It's not quite that high, but I wouldn't recommend supplementing it, particularly if you're taking vitamin D3, because that increases calcium absorption by up to 20-fold. I would recommend you eat it, and a dairy source is the most absorbable form. There's great research on dairy, both epidemiological and otherwise, to show that those who eat the most dairy have the best body composition and the best all-cause mortality. That's been done in nationwide studies as well. If you cannot tolerate lactose from milk, then maybe you can use a yogurt. It's lower in lactose. And if you can't tolerate that, then a cheddar cheese is very low, almost completely devoid of lactose, and you can still get your calcium. If beyond that, if you can't take in any dairy or any cheese or any yogurt, then a bone-in salmon or sardines can give you the necessary calcium that you need.
Cool. So micronutrients are the first thing that you've been talking about. It seems like that's kind of the foundation of the vertical diet, is making sure that the micronutrients are taken care of. When you're looking at macronutrients for some of these, for like these world's strongest man athletes, or even some of the smaller, like you mentioned, a ballerina that you were working with, what what are the deciding factors that would determine how much fat or carbohydrate is going to be in the diet, and how do you play around with those two macronutrients?
Okay, well, if you're trying to lose weight and you're an active individual lifting weights or performing sports, you're probably better off going with a little higher protein, say 1.2 grams per pound.
Hmm.
Because you're dieting, it's going to help preserve muscle mass better. It's also going to be satiating, give you a higher thermic effect of food. So it gives you kind of a net calorie benefit. That's what I'll do with protein for people who are trying to lose weight who are active, about 1.2 grams per pound. If you're trying to gain weight, it's really hard to gain weight on a high protein diet for all the same reasons: highly satiating, high thermic effect of food. So I actually lower protein. I might get it down to zero point 0.8, zero point 0.7, maybe even zero point 0.6 grams per pound,
Wow.
and then drive carbohydrates very high. Carbohydrates are muscle sparing. They'll be used preferentially for energy. So um, that's how I'll adjust protein for people. Even people who are trying to build muscle, bodybuilders in the off season who need to put on 10 or 20 or 30 pounds even, um, I'll bring their protein down. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's what the science supports. It's certainly what I've experienced and works best for my athletes. I tried to eat 2 grams per pound of protein to gain muscle when I was a smaller athlete, and it's impossible to
Yeah.
gain weight high protein diet. If I've got just an average Joe, a dad bod or a soccer mom, and I want them to lose weight, I'll tell them to eat as much protein as they can in a day. Obviously being cautious to how much fat is accompanying that protein. I'd give them, a top sirloin instead of a ribeye, for example. And they have a hard time eating enough food to gain weight. They end up losing weight because of the satiety effect of it. So that's where my protein's at. A gram per pound would kind of be the maintenance level. And then fats are, for me, health, A, D, E, and K, and also transporting nutrients in and out of the cells. Every cell has a lipid bilayer, a fatty layer that needs fats to help curry those nutrients in and out of the cells. 0.3 grams per pound is about a minimum. That's where I'll go. And you could certainly go higher if you choose to go keto. If you go keto, then I'm hoping that we don't do too much saturated fat, even though the research suggests that moderate amounts are safe. I'm cautious to get over 70%. I don't think it should be that high.
Hmm.
So I'm not eating sticks of butter, and I'm not eating too much bacon, even though bacon's fine. I'm cautious to get some eggs in there, to get some salmon in there, to get some dairy in there, get some leaner red meats in there. So fats are 0.3 grams per pound, up to whatever you decide based on your preference for carbohydrate intake. And then that takes us to carbohydrates. And to me, that's the rest. Whatever you decide your fats are going to be and your proteins are going to be, based on your calorie demands, the carbs would just be the rest. You just fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
And it's going to be up to, depending on the size of the individual and their workload.
So if you got a high workload, more carbohydrates; less workload, less carbohydrate.
Yeah, well, let's say you've got a 200-pound person and you want to give them 200 grams of protein and about 70 grams of fats. If that 200-pound person burns, has a basal metabolic rate with workload, say, of 2,500 calories a day, then the rest of those calories would be carbs. They'd get their 200 grams of protein, they'd get their 70 grams of fats, and then the rest would be carbs. Well, let's say that 200-pound person is a CrossFitter training 3 times a day and they burn 4,200 calories. Well, they're still getting 200 grams of protein, they're still getting 70 grams of fat, but now the rest of those calories are going to be carbs. So there could be a huge difference between any two people in terms of their carbohydrate intake based on their calorie demand, their workload in particular.
Hmm. What about? Have you ever heard of steroids?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Let's talk about the steroids thing. I think people always get interested in this, especially looking at bodybuilding, looking at things like powerlifting. You got a lot of demand there, a lot of demand on the body. What do you think about the state of steroids in athletics today? And yeah, I'd kind of love to hear your perspective on the whole steroids issue.
Well, it kind of goes back to, if you want to be healthy, don't compete. I competed in professional bodybuilding and powerlifting throughout my career, and 100% of the athletes that I competed against used performance enhancing drugs, as did I throughout my career. So it was a level playing field, and you still need to mitigate damage. And I think that one of the biggest problems that has occurred in probably the last decade, and maybe a little longer, is that people think that it's a more is better scenario, and that people are winning because they take more drugs. And in fact, that's not the case. Back when I first totaled 2,000 pounds, and even Dorian Yates has talked about this back in the late 80s when he was competing. People going from 1 cc of testosterone a week to 2 cc's thought that was a big deal. And now there's people taking that on a daily basis. It's absolutely asinine, the dosages that are being used. There's certainly adverse effects. I get people that ask me all the time about steroids, and if they haven't taken them, I'm recommending they don't. If you want to compete in IFBB as an IFBB pro, or as a world record power lifter, or as a world's strongest man, you're probably not going to be able to do that without them. So that's a decision that you're going to have to make. They're prevalent in sports, as we all know. They do work. There are side effects, and the side effects are dose dependent, and in some cases, the products that you take can have a significant impact on whether or not you incur problems with your liver or high blood pressure, etc. So, I mean, it's a huge, broad topic that's hard to just hit in a Reader's Digest version, but they're certainly prevalent. Even now, since I've been retired for the last 5 years, because I'm hypogonadal, I don't have adequate testosterone. I use what we call testosterone replacement therapy to keep my levels generally between 400 and 900. I get blood tests done every month. I have done that for almost 15 years. Had over 150 blood tests throughout my career. So I've monitored all these things, and I've noticed, depending on what I was taking and how much, the impact that it had on my health. And, I discovered in many cases that more wasn't better. It just created more side effects. When I was almost 310 pounds at the world's strongest pro bodybuilder, I was using more performance enhancing drugs than I had used previously. And I wasn't any stronger than I was at 270 using half the amount. So,
and you had you had more side effects at that time?
Oh, a ton more side effects. Yeah, higher liver enzymes, higher insulin resistance, higher cholesterol. All of those things are very common with testosterone use, or I just say performance enhancing drugs in general, because there's some drugs that cause higher blood pressure, more insulin resistance, such as growth hormone, things like high prolactin and high estrogen for products like DECA and Tren. There's a whole host of products out there that can cause significantly more side effects. I will say this, with respect to bodybuilding and people dieting for competitions, very little performance enhancing drugs are needed. I don't know why people think they need to take more stuff going into a bodybuilding show. When you're at a calorie deficit, you're not going to build a lot of muscle. As a matter of fact, you're probably not going to build any. And particularly not for an advanced athlete that's been training for many years. All you want to do is retain muscle. And that can be done very successfully on a very low dose without all the side effects. The problem is that people start taking more stuff going into a show, and they end up with elevated estrogen, elevated prolactin, insulin resistance from, say, too much growth hormone. And it's counterproductive. And then they start taking anti-estrogens, which is a huge problem for joints and for strength. And you can end up losing muscle tissue as a result. I mean, I'm just kind of going on and on. This is a never-ending conversation, but I'm just cautious to say that more isn't better, that people should get blood tests, and there's many things that they can do to mitigate damage with proper sleep, proper nutrition, proper hydration. And I just don't think enough people pay attention to all of those things.
Do you see a lot of, it seems like a lot of gym rats are jumping on it unnecessarily to me. Like, you see people with physiques that could probably be achieved naturally, that are using a lot of stuff to get there. It seems like there is a lot of unnecessary usage of it, just in like, weekend warrior type people who maybe don't need it, aren't going to see as much of a benefit as they want. It might be giving themselves some negative side effects down the line. Do you think this is?
Yeah, particularly if you don't have low testosterone. I work with one of the strongest guys on the planet, uh, and he's a natural, drug-tested, lifetime drug-tested athlete. Squats over 1,000 pounds. His testosterone is 400.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I too, I always thought that your testosterone, the higher the better. Uh, if you have adequate testosterone, if you're just in the normal range, um, you can perform very well at that level with enough discipline and hard work and consistency. We know that, like Greg Knuckles, like the guys from Barbell Medicine, Austin Baraki and Jordan Fagenbaum, these are very strong people, squatting and deadlifting well over 600, 700 pounds, that are natural athletes. Greg's a young guy, was a world record holder in powerlifting, and he's a natural athlete. There's lots of great natural athletes and they're out there doing some great things, but they're also very smart, very disciplined, very consistent, very hardworking. And I think that a lot of folks think it's a shortcut, and it may very well be. It may help you, in the short run, to put on a few pounds of muscle and gain a little bit of strength. But then it's going to stop, and you still have to do all the other things to go to the next level. That's why I'm always very first thing I say is, look, everybody I competed against in the IFBB and in powerlifting was using performance enhancing drugs. It's a level playing field. So now what do you do? If everybody else is using them and you're using them, do you just use more? Is there some magic blend? No to both of those questions. That's not the answer. At some point, you're still going to have to knuckle down and start to train harder and smarter and sleep better and eat better, train longer. And all of that is going to have to be the ultimate differentiator between you and everybody else who's doing the same thing as you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not like a magic pill. It's just gonna put you ahead of everybody else and make you into Superman. Right? You got to put in the work too. You can't just boost your testosterone and expect that to do everything.
And supraphysiological doses of performance enhancing drugs, or any medication for that matter, is going to have adverse health effects, some worse than others. You certainly should be aware of those and get a blood test and try and mitigate those in whichever way that is warranted, whether it's high iron and donating blood, or whether it's high liver enzymes and using TUDCA and NAC, and whether it's high blood sugars and trying to address those with better sleep apnea, thyroid function. I could go on and on. I address this in great detail in my program, but having said that, being hypogonadal, having low testosterone, is also associated with adverse health effects and all-cause mortality. Mm-hmm. So those people who are using hormone replacement therapy to stay in a safe range improve their health outcomes. But those people who use supraphysiological doses, as I did throughout my powerlifting career, will subject themselves to side effects, some worse than others. And if they have a predisposition, as Dallas McCarver did with his heart condition, then it could be very serious, the side effects that could occur. And if you don't know, if you haven't gone into the doctor and been tested to see what your exposure is, or gotten a blood test, then it's just pot luck. You have no idea what kind of damage you're going to do long term. I have numerous friends who have had kidney replacements or are on dialysis. This isn't something you stick your head in the sand. And I work with a lot of athletes who are on performance enhancing drugs. And one of the things I do is try and mitigate damage. I try and make sure their blood pressure isn't too high, their cholesterol isn't too high. I make sure they don't have fatty liver disease. We check their blood work, and we put together diets and look at their sleep and the like to try and mitigate those health problems. We also, this is very important, we also diet them down. When Hafthor came to me at 435 pounds, he had all the fatty liver disease. He told me he was getting fatter and not stronger. And we took 40 pounds off of him to try and improve his insulin sensitivity, his cholesterol, his blood pressure, all of those things. And then using the right foods and the right training protocol, and getting him CPAP for sleep apnea, 10-minute walks after meals, vitamin D3 to increase insulin sensitivity, and utilizing the foods that we've talked about, I took him back up to 450 pounds. And his fasted glucose is normal. It's 83. His HA1C is lower than mine. It's 5.1. His AST, ALT are normal. His liver enzymes, his creatinine, his kidney function is good. It's not abnormal. He's, by all measures, I'm not saying that being 450 pounds is an ideal longevity pursuit. But by all measures, we've performed the tests necessary to give us the best indicators possible of his health status, and he's doing very, very well, as did Brian, by changing his body composition and getting in a CPAP and taking vitamin D3 because he was deficient, and changing his insulin sensitivity. All of those things are huge, and one of the ways we did that is we took weight off of them. That's I mentioned when we talked about different diets. 95% of the health benefits you realize are from the weight loss itself, regardless of the diet. And if you're a huge athlete, a power lifter, a strongman, and you're staying heavy all year round, that's a problem. Nobody would ever suggest you should lift heavy all year round. You always take deloads, and you take breaks. The same thing with your body weight. If you would lose a little bit of weight, take one step back to get healthy, and then gain it back in the right fashion, you could take 2 steps forward. And over the course of your career, you could be significantly better if you just be willing to go through those health correcting, you call it, protocols throughout your training.
You mentioned cholesterol, like as one of the biomarkers that you're watching when you're looking at athletes, when you're looking at health. What's your perspective on high cholesterol? We got a lot of different opinions out there. Of course, a lot of people watching this right here into more carnivorous diets, ketogenic diets, at least meat-heavy diets. And a lot of these people on low-carbohydrate diets find that they have high LDL cholesterol, also high HDL, low triglycerides. What do you think about cholesterol as a biomarker in general, kind of bird's eye view of your perspective on a very, of course, nuanced and not so simple subject?
Yeah, you hit on all the big things already. A lot of the research from Ivar Cummings and Dave Feldman, and with respect to the fact that total cholesterol and LDL probably isn't the leading indicator for cardiovascular disease. Mm-hmm. Looking at triglycerides and HDL tends to be protective. Triglycerides are a good indicator, I think, of prediabetes. I think even if your blood sugars are normal, if your fasted glucose and your insulin levels and your HA1C are normal, but your triglycerides are high, then I think it's a leading indicator that you're headed that direction. And that can be, triglycerides can be kind of the leading indicator of insulin resistance, at which point you might need to watch your carbohydrates. I implement the 10-minute walks for that very reason. They're twice as effective as metformin for controlling blood sugars. I use them. That's all I use exclusively for dieting physique, figure, bikini, bodybuilding competitors, and that I use that with strength athletes after each meal to help them with nutrient partitioning and to lower blood sugars. Cholesterol is the fireman; it's not the fire, as you know. That endothelial damage to the blood vessels is what we're concerned about, and that happens with high blood pressure, it happens with high blood sugars, and it happens with high iron. Those are 3 probably of the leading problems. And so if we can control blood sugars and blood pressure and iron, and our endothelial walls are healthy, then there's a lot more room to move in terms of cholesterol and its potential cardiovascular effects. If someone's concerned about their cholesterol, if they have high LDL, but they have a good triglyceride to HDL ratio, which seems to be something under 2-to-1, but they're still concerned, then they can go get a CAC scan to look for coronary artery calcification. They're very affordable in the U.S. in particular. I think I got one done for less than $100. Mm-hmm. And that would give them a better indicator if they had any pre-existing cardiovascular disease risk. And that's, that's kind of an evolving field, the cholesterol thing. We used to think that if you had high total cholesterol that you had an increased cardiovascular disease risk. And in fact, now we see it's much more nuanced than that, as you mentioned. So I think you should get a lipid test. I think you should pay attention in particular to your triglyceride to HDL ratio. And you should manipulate your nutrition and your training and your sleep in particular, which has a huge impact. Some people aren't aware that thyroid function has a huge impact on cholesterol levels. Just like thyroid function has a huge impact on blood pressure. And things such as sleep apnea can have a huge adverse effect on blood pressure and thyroid function. So all of those things are related. That's why I keep, talking about things like sleep and the 10-minute walks and those kinds of things, because and your blood pressure, because they're all really causal. Whereas cholesterol is a marker, not a maker of cardiovascular disease. The makers are that the endothelial damage, high blood pressure, high blood sugars, and those should be kept under control at all times.
Well said. Well said. So to kind of start wrapping it up here, I'd like to hit on something that's really close to my heart. You know, being somebody who we're rural people, we live in an area where we've got chickens, cows, animals, and our goal is to essentially be self-sustained off the land we live on. We've seen a huge push the last couple of years, especially for the reduction of animal foods and even the banning of animal foods from the diet. You made a post on Instagram the other day, maybe it was a couple weeks ago, and that's why I reached out to you. I mean, I think you actually tagged me in that post where you're talking a little bit about the agenda to ban meat. And again, of course, this is a real nuanced subject, not really so sound clip, short clip friendly. But what do you think about this whole thing with this anti-meat agenda, the pushing of planetary dietary guidelines that are plant-based, and the potential talk of taxing or even now banning meat?
Well, again, it's more of the vegan propaganda. Um, if they can't get you to believe their ethical position on the consumption of animals because they consider them to be sentient beings, then they're gonna defer to a whole bunch of other fear tactics and claim that it's ruining the environment and all these other things. Boy, there's so many different lame arguments that you hate to
Right.
too distracted by it all. The whole sentient being thing, where they don't want to eat a cow, but they don't care how many rabbits and squirrels and snakes and birds and butterflies and foxes are killed, and for growing the soy that they're eating. It's kind of asinine. It's virtue signaling at best. If it's a decision that they make for their ethics, just don't try and impose it on everyone else. What we've seen is that it's a life cycle. We need animals. It's a circle. We need them to shit on the ground so that we can have the nitrogen to grow, our vegetables and what have you. In the absence of the animals, you don't have plants. You can't continue mining that from the nitrogen from nitrogen sources and exporting it and flying it and trucking it to fields and spreading it around. It's a finite resource. One of the things that's interesting is that when you look at the research that was done by Frank Mitloehner, I think maybe it was the post that I made. Frank's from he's UC Davis, and he says that these arguments, they're ridiculous because we've actually reduced the number of animals that we utilize, and their impact has been hugely overstated. Obviously, fossil fuels and transportation is the leading cause of an increase in CO2. And cows make a very small contributor to that. And we've dramatically reduced our cattle numbers. Dairy cattle's fallen from 25 million to 9 million in the last 70 years. And the methane production from livestock is actually reducing. And we've never had smaller herds than we do today. We're producing the same amount of meat as we did when we had larger numbers. And these plant-based alternatives are using, hype and just unsubstantiated dogma to try and convince people to stop eating meat, and it's really just baloney.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, again, that's a real nice way of putting it. Real diplomatic way of putting it. Depending on what mood I'm in, I could get more animated with that one. What about this one? Some people are asking about. I haven't seen the video, but apparently there's a vegan kid from vegan YouTube named Vegan Gains that made a video talking about the vertical diet, making some critiques on it. Did you happen to check that one out?
Yeah, he has a kind of a history of of cherry picking research using, again, more of this horrible epidemiology. You know, we talked about the fact that the AIM study completely debunked everything that he has been promoting for years. Even Walter Willett, you know, the vegan god, has said that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern. He just has a habit of lying about his research. He mentioned some study about eggs and increase in cholesterol. And of course, he used epidemiology. It was, you know, food frequency questionnaires. It wasn't causal, it was correlative. And, you know, the advisory committee for the dietary guidelines has said very clearly, it's in their 2015 recommendations, that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. It's consistent with the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology's report. So, you know, he's just continues to put out bad information. It's the same old Ansel Keys stuff. It's the cholesterol heart hypothesis that's long since been debunked. So, you know, it's of no value to listen to people who are so steeped in their religion that they can't, you know, see to provide any actual factual information to people.
Yeah, that's funny. Sometimes it seems like, you know, according to the vegans, it's good research and it's good science if it proves their preconceived notions on what it should prove, and it's bad science if it contradicts their assumptions. That seems to be.
Well, it's always cherry-picked epidemiology, which is kind of where we started with Dr. Ioannidis. All of that research is complete and utter garbage. So it's a waste of time to even talk about it. You can always find a study, a peer-reviewed, published epidemiology study that's going to say whatever you want it to say.
Yeah. Did he happen to challenge you to a fight in his video, or did you not get that treatment?
I don't know. I didn't see the whole thing. I saw some snippets. I just saw some people had sent me some clips and asked me about this, that, or the other. I've got thousands of clients all over the world. I guess he did say that I was killing people with my diet, which I find hilarious, because I've got tens of thousands of people who have now utilized the vertical diet, and I've got testimonials from people all over the world who have lowered their body fat, their blood pressure, gotten off of type 2 diabetics, gotten off of insulin medication, you know, type 1 diabetics who have cut it in half. You know, we've been saving lives and improving lives all over the world using you know, these simple, sensible, and sustainable nutrition tips and diet plans that, you know, they perform the same thing he's trying to do. They're trying to help people lose weight, trying to help people improve blood pressure and blood sugar and cholesterol. We're certainly focused on those markers as well. And so he's just promoting his own agenda because he believes that cows are pets and he doesn't want to see anybody eating them. But you know, and then if he has to impose his ethics upon you with legislation or with lies, then he'll do that. You know, and try and use fear mongering and scaring people rather than just trying to convince them with facts. Then he'll do that, and I think that's a terrible way to go.
I think it's funny when you talk to some of these vegans, and you know, and him in particular. You know, when I spoke to him, you ask him, "Do you think morality is objective? Is there objective right and wrong?" Almost always they'll say no. Morality is subjective, but then they'll want to force their subjective version of their reality that they believe in their own worldview is just made up by their own preference. They believe that it's right to force that on the world. I always think that's an interesting contradiction within their
Yeah,
paradigm.
anytime it leads to legislation, that's the scary part now. That's why it's become such a big battle, is because they want politicians to legislate behavior by, you know, having meat-free days or taxing, using, you know, carbon credits to tax the production of red meat. And there's just no evidence to suggest that that's going to be of any benefit. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the environment. It has to do with imposing their morality, whether it's through fear tactics or through legislation and politics. They'll do it.
Yeah, they're kind of tying it in with this like eco-religion thing that we see kind of popping up all around. You know, all the kids in school get told the Earth is dying, you're killing the planet with your evil CO2 off-gassing, and babies are so bad, and human beings are terrible, and everything else is part of nature, but we're apart from nature, and we're not a piece of it. We're different. We're bad. It's really alarming though how many kids are falling for this. I know you're a father, right? You got kids.
Hmm. Yeah,
They've
and I'm really happy when I can get them to eat steak. That's what really. I don't sit there and worry about how much spinach they eat. I make sure they get a gram of protein per pound of body weight. It was interesting. I was at the NSCA's national conference this year, and Jose Antonio is the president of the ISSN. He's a PhD, and he has two daughters that are college age that play sports. And he was talking to parents about, how do we get our kids to eat healthy? And he said, look, he said, make sure they get a gram of protein per pound of body weight. He said, and then stay out of their way. And that was pretty much, it was pretty simple. And
yeah.
it kind of, it struck me. And of course, I try and get my kids a variety of sources. I try and get them an egg every day, a little bit of red meat every day. I try and get them, some dairy every day. It would be yogurt or milk. And really, I just focus on getting a gram of protein per pound of body weight. And I know that they'll grow adequately from that. And whatever else they eat, whether it be potatoes or rice or carrots or fruit or, occasional snack or treat, then I'm fine with that.
Yeah, we do similar. We load them up on the animal foods, and my kids, they'll if I'm sitting down with a steak, I'll have to like hide it from them because they'll point out that the corner of the ribeye where you've got that big old glob of fat. They always want to eat that part. They always want to eat the best, fattiest parts of my steaks.
Yeah, no,
They
that's
know.
great. And you have to understand that's a huge difference between us and a vegan parent. And I'm not making any, I'm not trying to say anything bad. We truly believe from the research that we've been reading for all these years that our kids need animal proteins, cholesterol, saturated fat, ADE and K, iron, B12, choline, zinc, to thrive and to grow. And they actually believe that that will be detrimental to their kids' health to eat any of those foods. And that's the difference between us. And we're just as confident about our recommendations as they are about theirs. And I don't know how to bridge that gap, but it's sad when you see vegan children that are malnourished and undersized and have, obviously the rate of brain growth and
Yeah.
IQ is all affected by a lack of micronutrients. And maybe if you're really, really good at it, you can get your kids to eat enough of those micronutrients as a vegan. But in most cases, my experience is that that's very difficult to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I live in a community where there's quite a few people trying to raise their kids vegan at one point a few years ago. Everybody's since gone back to eating meat, which is kind of interesting. There's like one or two vegan leaning families left, but you see it. I mean, you definitely see it when kids get together. You see the behavioral differences in some of them, the perceptual differences. You could see there's the way that they react to stimulus in their environment. Um, at least in my own experience in the area I live, the vegan and vegetarian kids, they're a few steps behind as far as development goes, and that's putting it nicely and respectfully. And I don't wish any harm on any of these kids. That's why I think it really is a very, very dangerous practice to put these kids on a vegan diet. And I would highly suggest anybody who's been doing it reconsider, look at the literature on it, look at the science on brain development as far as vegan vegetarians go, and shoot, I mean, just even low cholesterol associations with depression, anxiety, suicide, violent crime, and impulsive behavior shows a lot about the importance of these nutrients that we're only getting from animal foods.
Well, and
Um,
it's not just you making that claim. There's many different countries, Belgium, there's a whole host of different countries that have stated that pregnant mothers, infants, and adolescents should not eat a vegan diet. It impairs their growth and their development. The only reason that the USDA hasn't made the same claim here in the U.S. Is because the American Dietetic Association was started by a Seventh-day Adventist, and it's largely funded by this group of people who are,
yeah.
financially interested in the anti-meat agenda. But they, even in those statements, they're quick to say that you need to supplement this and supplement that and supplement this. So it is definitely detrimental. And if it's detrimental for pregnant women and infants and adolescents, then how can it be beneficial for a high-performing adult who's, athletics or busy individual? The only reason they can survive is because they're robbing their own nutrients in the meantime to make up for the deficiencies.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, it's really sad to see these athletes. Cam Newton comes to mind. He's one of the most obvious ones right now with multiple injuries, might be out for the rest of the season. Wasn't healing from a shoulder injury, then injured his foot. I mean, it's just we're seeing the deterioration that on paper it makes sense why it would happen, and we see it right before our very eyes in these athletes. And kids require these nutrients as they develop. Athletes require these nutrients as they beat the shit out of their bodies unnecessarily. And I think it's really important that we consider the bioavailability of these nutrients in animal foods and that we consider how easily digestible they are. So the last little thing I'd like to hit on with you here, and then I'll let you get on with your busy life, Stan. What do you think about the whole carnivore diet thing? You got guys like Dr. Sean Baker slaying it, setting records on in rowing with an all meat diet, doing really well without any plant foods at all. This kind of throws a wrench in the whole narrative of the plant-based diet for health and for sustainability and whatnot. What do you think about this carnivorous diet as far as like performance goes? What do you think about this phenomenon? And do you ever lean people towards a carnivorous-ish diet, or do you avoid it?
Well, I think generally speaking, I have said in my seminar in Iceland has over 3 million views now on YouTube. And I opened by saying that red meat is a superfood. It's the only one that you can not only survive on, but thrive on. You can't do that with kale or acai berry or however you pronounce that. And it's hugely important. And there's been many studies that go back many years of people who have eaten just red meat. The carnivore diet includes more than that, which I think is fantastic. It's red meat, whole eggs, and salmon, generally speaking, is the base of the diet, the foundation. And if you're talking to Paul Saladino, then you're nose to tail and you're adding liver and some sort of bone, whether it's broths, boiled bone broths for the glycine, etc. I've said that I think it's the ultimate elimination diet. If you have some sort of ailment, skin condition, IBS, IBD, Crohn's disease, if you have some sort of digestion issue or autoimmune disorder, which are generally digestion related or caused, that's where you start. Because that's the diet that'll give you, 99% of everything that everybody should have with the least likelihood of adverse effects. And so there are many times when I'll start with that diet for people who have, gastric reflux, or GERD, or a host of different digestion problems, because everything's in there. If you're going to eat a ribeye and some whole eggs and a salmon, you can damn well near be done. There's some contention as to whether or not you can get adequate vitamin C, but I think the argument now is that it appears you have less need for vitamin C when you don't have the carbohydrates in the diet. But without going down too big of a wormhole, it works for Sean. It works for a lot of people. It seems anecdotal at this point because nobody's really researched it. The publication by the Annals of Internal Medicine seems to show us that red meat is not adverse to health. And also the PURE study that was done, which was the largest epidemiological study with Dr. Youssef, the head of the world, the president of the, not the World Health Organization, but the World Heart Federation. He too found that red meat was protective, neutral or protective of cardiovascular disease. So I think it's beneficial. This is an exciting time to be in this industry in nutrition, more so than ever in the past, because with the advent of social media, we're seeing more and more people challenging the largely, the financial interests that have been pushing our nutrition agenda for so long. The Ansel Keys of the world were able to get away with stifling, the opposition when Mary Enig came forth in the 70s and said that trans fats were going to kill us, and they blackballed her and just about got her fired. And then all of the monies that were poured into the American Heart Association by the Procter and Gamble basically was used to just to stifle anybody else's opposition. And now you've got, with social media, all these great scientists coming out and saying, look, this is not factual. That so more of the research is being done. And Dr. Sean Baker said recently that Harvard was actually going to take up a carnivore study. It'd be really interesting to see what comes out of that. There's still a big fight as to how much fiber, and you see that there's kind of two sides to that: how much and what type of fiber is needed. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out. And the gut biome, which we know very little about, and they're sticking to diversity as being the driver of potentially, markers for health outcomes. But we still know very little about that. So I'm interested in seeing, I do recommend some vegetables in my diet. I do eat some vegetables, but I'm less and less convinced of the benefit, to be honest with you, so long as, you're not smoking and you're not drinking and you're getting adequate protein and micronutrients and adequate sleep and exercising regularly. I don't see now where you can make a huge or make a very definitive statement about how much more or less beneficial adding fibers to that diet is. I personally, from the way I feel, I mentioned that I feel a little better on some carbohydrates. And generally speaking, it's fruit and some dairy. I eat yogurt every day and I eat fruit every day. I don't necessarily eat rice or potatoes every day.
Okay.
I just eat those kind of around workouts. I'll definitely get, on days that I train legs, I might eat an extra meal and I might eat more rice. On days that I don't train, then I'm just eating a couple of oranges and a couple of servings of yogurt, and most of the rest of it is eggs, salmon, and ruminants, beef and lamb and bison. So I do think that some people can perform better without carbs. Maybe I'm phrasing this incorrectly. Endurance athletes seem to be able to tolerate a keto diet better than anaerobic athletes. I think anaerobic athletes thrive better on some carbohydrates. And even those endurance athletes that go keto, some of them have trouble with the keto flu, the brain fog, and that kind of thing. Generally, it's because they're sodium depleted. When they lose their glycogen, they also lose their salt. And so they definitely need to throw that back in. I have keto clients. I have vegan clients, vegetarian clients. I have a whole assortment of different clients. And, my goal is to make sure that they can get all their micronutrients. They have adequate sodium and they sleep well and they exercise regularly and their body composition is improved. And the way I do that is to make sure that they're not hungry and they're not tired. And I have to, pay very close attention to them. If the diet they're eating makes them hungry and tired, the likelihood of them to comply long-term is pretty slim. And so I'm trying to find a diet that's more of a lifestyle for them. I certainly don't believe there's any one path to that destination. I think there's many paths. I recently had a client whose doctor told her that he wouldn't help her unless she went keto. And I think that's pretty asinine. I think that if we can help people lose weight and feel great and maintain a lifestyle rather than a diet they go off and on, that's much more important than the type of the diet they're on. And that's true of the vertical diet or paleo or keto or a vegan or vegetarian. It doesn't matter to me. I want to find what works for the individual and make sure it's simple, sensible, and sustainable. And it becomes a lifestyle that they feel good on it, that they're not hungry and tired all the time. And they have energy and they don't have brain fog and they can perform.
Fantastic. Yeah, I found that I lean towards if I've got a lot of anaerobic activity, if I'm sprinting a lot, or I live in Ecuador, so like here everyone plays soccer, football, in the rest of the world. But so I love to go out and play soccer. So I'll find some days I got a lot of anaerobic activity. I'd load up on the carbohydrates those days, and it definitely helps. And I find myself leaning towards the carbs that you recommend. So I think it's cool seeing how many people come to the same conclusions that you reached a long time ago and that you've been teaching about with your vertical diet. I find myself using these principles myself, and I really appreciate the work you're doing putting this out there. Stan Efferding, anything coming down the line that you're excited about? Anything that you want to inform the people in the chat, the people watching live, and the people watching this later on about as far as the vertical diet goes and what you're doing out there in the world of nutrition, fitness, powerlifting, bodybuilding?
Yeah, two big things. One, I mentioned compliance is the science. No matter what diet you're on, they all work when they're strictly adhered to. So I created an app called the Vertical Tracker, and it's just a compliance app. It's supposed to help people with a daily checklist to stay on track and help them to lose weight and to get healthy. And I hope to have that out. I've been working on it for damn near a year, spent a fortune on it. And you know how programmers are, they just take forever. Of course, that's how they get paid. But I think that I hope to have that out in December sometime, if not sooner. Look forward to the Vertical Diet Compliance app. It will be in the App Store. And also the Vertical Diet book. We're finally through Victory Belt Publishing. This coming spring, we'll have a hard copy of the Vertical Diet book for people. Obviously, the Vertical Diet ebook is available currently at stanefferding.com. Those are the big things I have on the horizon. Other than that, I'm just trying to help as many people as possible, trying to change lives all over the world, people with their health and performance. And it's just been a godsend to be able to finally do this after all these many years of being kind of a hobby, the industry being a hobby for me and studying it all my life, to finally be able to now focus full time in the health industry.
Amazing. What about the cooler? You got the logo for the cooler behind you. I know you got a patent on that thing, don't you?
Yeah, you know, we signed a deal with Damon John with Shark Tank, and we've been promoting it. We got a new cooler out, the Cooler Sport, a little half-gallon version, and that's been going really well. That's on Amazon. You can just look up the cooler with a K, and the Cooler Sport is the new half-gallon version that's on Amazon. That's fun. You know, it's nice to have all these different ventures going on. It keeps me busy. I've got 2 kids. I travel every weekend. I'm usually in a different city. I've been in 10 countries and 40 states in the last 18 months.
Wow.
Giving out the message, showing people the diet, teaching them how to lift, bench, squat, deadlift, and answering their questions. And so I've got seminars coming up in New York and Pennsylvania, Canada, Texas. I've got a map on my site. My Instagram's at Stan Efferding, and I'm usually just about every weekend I'm in a different city giving seminars.
Cool. So can people find out, is there a schedule on your website,
Yeah,
stanefferding.com?
yeah, stanefferding.com under seminars. I've got a whole schedule of what's coming up.
Awesome. All right, man. Well, hey, if you ever come down to Ecuador, I'll be coming to your seminar. Stan Efferding, it's been an honor talking to you. Really appreciate you coming on. And you guys can find a link. I'll put a link up to his website and to his, you got a YouTube channel as well. I really enjoy Rhino's Rants on his Stan Efferding YouTube channel. So I'll put a link over there to his website and to the YouTube channel in the description below on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, or any of the platforms where you can listen to Primal Edge Health, you'll be able to click on the show notes and check out the show notes on our website, primaledgehealth.com, for more information on how to get in touch with the legendary Mr. Stan Efferding, the Rhino Stan Efferding. And yeah, thanks for coming on, Stan.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, brother.